Now, going back to Seinfeld,
Okay.
were there any other editors on the show?
No, I was it. And there was an editor who took over when I left, and there was obviously one for the first two years that I wasn't there. But yeah, on sitcoms, you're it. That's it. And I think the fun thing about being the editor, and I refer to it as being in editorial, I don't refer to it as being in post-production, and this is my own little specific thing, is I think as an editor, we are part of production because we're doing our jobs when people are shooting. We're part of literally a writing staff, if you want to look at it that way, that we really are the last word in writing. And Larry had my room ultimately right next to all the writers. And I think it was a testament to how that job is really perceived. And I always think of it as post-production happens after editing. And I think that a lot more editors should really start seeing what it is their jobs really are and really try to sensitize people to that. I think that for a lot of editors, especially in today's world, we're so used to having to do sound effects and all sorts of opticals and titles and credits and all sorts of things like that, that what we do is not a rough cut. What we do is an editor's cut, a director's cut, a first cut, whatever, but it's not a rough cut. I mean, a rough cut literally is just cutting the slates off of something and calling it dailies. But I think that what we have to turn out in today's world is so much more sophisticated that a lot of producers will even say, I want to see the show in your cut the way it's going to look when it airs on television. So I think the demand is so much greater, and got completely off the tangent of the question you asked, but there you go.
No, that's a great answer. You were talking about being next to the writers
Right.
there. So can we talk a little bit about that editing process and how Larry and the other writers were involved?
Sure. Larry was very gracious that the writer who had written the episode, he would always have come into the editing room. The genius with Larry, though, and I don't think any writer could touch him on this, was we would shoot episodes that for air were supposed to be 22 minutes long, and very often we'd be like 10, 12, 15 minutes over. And the genius that he had was knowing what to keep and what to lose. And we lost some pure gold. And there were times when you would really have to say, no, Larry, I don't want to cut that material. There was one great case, and I think a lot of the show had great texture to it. And it was one where George was sitting with his mom and dad, and he was using the ketchup, and they got into a big argument about using the ketchup. And he said, well, I buy the ketchup, I get to use it. And Larry at one point said, well, we can lose that because it's not about story. And I said, no, it's just so terrific. It's so George. We have to keep it. And it was one of those that ultimately we did keep it. But and that was also a tribute to Larry, where he would really listen to other people. I think with a lot of the writers, though, that I could literally go into a room and just say, okay, writing-wise, I know what you intended, but I think we could actually make something better of that if I intercut a few of these scenes. Do you mind? And I would just do it quickly, and they would come in and look at it. And really, they started to see writing-wise where they could go with their writing because it could be executed editorially. So there was a great relationship there.
That's a great concept because that makes it a circle.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. So what did you learn about comedy from Larry David?
Larry was one of those people that you could literally say to Larry, why is that funny? And he could tell you that there were certain ingredients that were there. And I think for one thing, there had to be an honesty about it. It couldn't be manufactured or fake. But one of the other things that he was also very good about was he's very respectful of the actor, so that if he wrote something that he knew was going to get a big laugh, he wanted that actor to get that laugh. He didn't want somebody else coming in and stealing that thunder and getting another laugh. And so sometimes a good case in point would be maybe Michael would come in and do something that was truly funny, but it would take away from that moment. And Larry wouldn't have you use that. I mean, Larry would really keep you in that honest moment of that actors. And so I think that was one of those things that I really learned from him. And I think the biggest one was the honesty of the storytelling, that it couldn't be manufactured and couldn't be fake. And I think also probably just his rhythm. I think he just has a very funny rhythm to him.
That's great. So how would you say you developed your editing style in regards to comic timing? Was there, and we had talked a little bit about the music before and thinking in that way, but in the specific timing of the comedy?
I think a lot of times what I liked on Seinfeld was the actors were always acting. So if somebody was getting a laugh, you always had someplace else to go to maybe even help that laugh. So I think the actors that we had were just so helpful on that level. Like you could look at something like the episode about masturbation, and you could look at that, and it's like when Kramer comes in and says, "I'm out." The actors weren't all just standing there. I mean, everybody had something that they were doing so that you could hold that laugh for all that time because there were so many places to go editorially. And sometimes I think that's one of the things that I'll try to tell actors is if you're always in that scene, I could always go to you as a great reaction shot. But if you're doing nothing, I'm not going to go there. And so I'll avoid maybe what's a great reaction shot from you. So I think that a lot of times actors create their own problem because they're not in that scene. So.
Yeah, that's interesting in regards to the difference between stage acting,
Right.
where those actors do have to do that when they're on a stage
Right.
and they're not on their line. They still
Right.
have to be in that character.
Well, I think maybe that's one of the differences that you have between a sitcom that's multi-camera and a comedy that's single camera, where the coverage is shot one piece at a time, as opposed to the sitcom where you're on a stage and you have that whole dynamic of literally doing a little play. And I think that you're also having what I always refer to as really the guest star every week, which was the audience, because they would interject their own rhythm with the laughter, and you would have to accommodate laughter that maybe you hadn't anticipated in a place or whatever, and really have them be part of the program. So.
That's great. Now you had talked about Larry using things in your life or comments or things that happened around the set as basis for some of the stuff that went on in the show.
Right.
Was there any subjects that he considered to be off limits?
Not at all. And I think that was one of the things that I really respected about him, was you could even take somebody like the Joe Davola character taking all the pictures of Elaine, and on some level that's kind of creepy, but somehow or other he made it funny. So I think there was no subject that he would shy away from, and that was one of the things that I found to be so refreshing about working with him.
It's that honesty,
Yeah.
truth thing. Were there times when you didn't have enough footage, or did the show usually run long?
The show always ran long, and I think a really fun moment was there was one episode that we did, and I believe it was the Cadillac, and Larry said to me, "How's the show?" And I said, "It's really good, but it's really long." It was just supposed to be our half-hour show. And I said, "I don't think you can cut anything." And Larry gave me one of those, "Don't worry about it. You're talking to the trained professional. I'll get the time out." And he and Jerry came in and looked at it and looked at each other at the end of it and said, "We can't lose anything." And I jokingly said, "Well, why don't you make it an hour?" Well, it turned out Warren Littlefield was on the lot that day, and they went down to Warren and asked him, could we make it an hour? And now this was a Thursday, and the show aired the following Thursday, and Warren said, "Certainly you can." So he had to do all of his scheduling changes, and there was a show on that was before us that Larry found out thematically had a theme that kind of bumped what we were doing, so he made them change the show they were going to air, and I thought, this is so great watching the power that we have on this show. It was just amazing. But that was the sort of things that you could do at that time, and it was really just absolutely incredible. But I have to also say that there was one person at NBC, Rick Ludwin, And Rick was literally the go-between between the network and our show. And I remember when we were going to do the show about masturbation, Rick went back to Warren, and Warren said, so what are they doing next week? And he told him, and he said, is it going to be okay? And he said, yeah, it's going to be fine. And that was it. That was the end of the discussion about subject matter or anything like that. And there was just this tremendous trust that the network had with Rick. And Rick so totally understood what it was that Larry was going to try and do, and Jerry, that he really always just was that guy that was really the big help and never got in the way. It was always just Rick just did a really phenomenal job. So wherever he is, kudos to him.
Now, you mentioned with that specific Cadillac episode that you were like a week out.
Right.
Was that the typical distance you were from air?
Sometimes, actually, we had one that we broadcast. Jerry looked at a show that we had already locked online, the whole thing, and said, you know, that stand-up doesn't belong on this episode. It actually belongs on next week's, and next week's maybe should be on this one. And the length of them was different. So suddenly we had to re-online, and I had to call our composer and play the stand-up over the phone for him so he could do the music for it. And I think we wound up broadcasting that one with, I think we had to satellite it to Canada, and I think we had something like 10 minutes to spare. So we did them, we did them last minute sometimes. But it was fun.
Now, in terms of, you mentioned the monologues.
Uh-huh.
Now, you know, there was a lot of innovative stuff that he did with those monologues in terms of setting up, you know, the beginning of the show. Did you
Right.
have much control of the editing of that, or was there any type of specific direction from Jerry in terms of cutting the monologue?
I think what would happen was I would get the monologue written out. And a lot of times we would know the length of it, and we would know that the show was running long, and I would cut the whole monologue, and then Jerry would look at it and tell me what he wanted to lose. So sometimes editorially it was a bit of a challenge to figure out how to manufacture those edits, but it was just what you did, and you know, we had to time it out to a certain length. But I know that, and we had talked about it a little bit earlier, when the show was going to go into syndication, I remember Larry, you know, getting control of the syndication rights to re-edit the shows and get them to time, and it was his idea to actually take the standouts out, the stand-ups out, to make it easier to cut to time.
Right. Now, were the stand-ups generally done one at a time for each show?
As I recall, they were, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, was there anything that Seinfeld changed in your approach to editing?
I think I just relaxed with editing a lot. I think a lot of times when you first start doing something that you're always trying to second guess what somebody wants, and suddenly you're in a world where it's like, these are your people, and you get you know what each one of them is going to do, and it's like, oh, I know Elaine wouldn't do that, or George wouldn't do that, or, you know, whatever it might be. So they become your own little characters, and you're spending so much of a day with them that I think you get very protective of them, and you sort of are more relaxed, I think, is what it really amounts to. I think that one of the George things that I remember was George was always wanted to pretend he was an architect. And I always wanted to date an architect. And I remember when I lived back in New York City, I was walking through Central Park, and this guy started talking to me, and he said, "Are you married?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And I wasn't. And he said, "What does your husband do?" And I said, "He's an architect." And I remember creating this whole fantasy world of this guy that I was supposedly married to. And this man says goodbye and leaves, and I thought, you took my fantasy with you. And so I so totally understood George's personality. So it was just a whole lot of fun to be doing that.
That's great. What would you say are the key elements in editing comedy?
I think probably the biggest one is understanding what the writer was intending and really having a sense of, and it all goes back to music, and it all goes back to a rhythm, and it all goes back to that little dance that you're trying to do, and really understanding what that is and being really very true to it. And I think also there's just a level of honesty. I don't think that it should be forced or manufactured. I don't think that, like, I get frustrated when I watch a show and just because somebody walks in a door, you have a laugh track. It's like, no, you have to earn that. And I think that's one of the things that gets frustrating with a lot of comedy today is it's become too easy. And I think that our audiences are pretty sophisticated. They know funny, and they know when to laugh, and they know when you're forcing a situation. And I think that was one of the things about Seinfeld was it really gave you that standard of what funny is and that honesty about it. And I think other shows sometimes are sorely lacking.
Great answer. So at what point did you realize that the show was becoming this pop culture phenomenon?
I think when we started getting photos from people with their birds watching different episodes, or, we would get we would get boxes of stuff. We would just, if we did stuff about Snapple, we would just be getting caseloads of Snapples, or we had Junior Mints, as many as we could possibly eat, and we would be getting fan mail. I think that was just one of the things that was amazing. Or you'd find out people were talking about the show, and they were just like there were cult followings about stuff, and that was fascinating. I think one of my favorite stories, though, was we had one character, and everybody probably remembers Babu Bhatt, who had the restaurant, and he was always, Jerry, you're a very bad man, that guy. He apparently had a green card, and he was going to have to leave the country. And we actually did an episode to make the immigration department realize that, yes, he was the only one who could do this part. And as I recall, it was one where Babu gets arrested by immigration. But I remember having to go out of our way to keep him in the country by doing a show.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you remember feeling just like if you were in conversation and meeting people away from working on the show, and they asked you what you were working on, and you were saying you worked on Seinfeld? Do you remember specific reactions that you would get?
Oh, I remember a woman getting really angry. And it was about, there was an episode where they have to get a mohel to do a bris. And I think it was one where Kramer didn't want to do it. And I remember the scene where Elaine is looking through the yellow pages trying to find a mohel. And she says, they've got models, motels, there's no mohels. How do you find a mohel? And I remember this lady getting really upset because she was Jewish. And it was the whole subject of not having a circumcision, and I finally said, I'm not the writer, go, get in touch with Larry or something. But yeah, people would just have very strong reactions, and some people, most of the time it was always just people absolutely loved the show, and they were just thrilled to death and wanted to know all sorts of things about what was Kramer really like and all of that. So it was just usually just like a lot of good times.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so let's talk about some of the notable episodes specifically.
Okay.
Now, with each of them, if you have a particular memory or story about how it came about, we can talk about that.
Okay.
And also about cutting it and any challenges that they may have had.
Okay.
So, and we talked a little bit about the parking garage in
Right.
terms of the direction.
Right.
But do you remember any specific challenges about cutting it?
Well, I think that was one where Tom Sharonis, the director, had laid out such a good game plan on how he wanted to do it that I think it was very much following his lead stylistically. I think that everything had been planned out so much ahead of time that I don't think there were any major problems or challenges editorially. And I think that the kind of footage that we had, just by its own design, you could take pieces out if you needed to and not have a big problem. So I think that really the uniqueness about that was really the directing, and the set design on that was just astounding.
Okay. And you also mentioned the subway earlier.
Oh, the subway was pretty great.
Yeah, and you won your first Emmy.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
for Subway. What do you think it was about that episode that made it stand out?
It was great. I think that was also a place where doing a sitcom, you didn't do that kind of you didn't do that kind of a show, and I think so much of it was integrating the show that they shot on the set on just one big car with, you know, the guys on the end just moving the cars and stuff, and then also getting the footage from New York with the subway cars and trying to remember, okay, would that car go that way? Would they be at that station? Who would be coming out? And making sure that everything looked like it really just fit. And I think editorially, it was just a lot of fun. And I think that another thing of just getting footage from New York was we had a guy back in New York that actually was a good stand-in for Kramer. And there were times when we would have to send the wardrobe back to New York for this guy and lay out shots that we needed for particular sequences to make it really work. So that was always a lot of fun too.
Okay. So usually when they shot the exterior stuff, were you involved in telling them that
Oh,
that's
yeah.
what you're relating?
Yeah, you would pretty much have to tell them exactly what shots you needed and, you know, if it needed to be a close-up, a wide shot, and which way people needed to be walking or moving. Because a lot of times you couldn't send them pieces of the scene. You just had to send them, you know, you just had to tell them the shots that were needed. And that was it. Because a lot of times now, you know, if you need inserts for a scene, you're generally sending a scene, but we didn't do that.
Okay. So what was it like when you won?
For the subway, I think I was shocked. I think that there was no part, up until that point, I was thinking, well, I just have this really cool job. And it just was this really cool job in this little environment. And suddenly it became a bigger deal. And I think I was just really pretty amazed.
Um,
And obviously I didn't know what to wear.
do you remember when you got up there what you were thinking?
I was thinking that I don't. I think true to form of an editor, you don't want it to be about you. So you really want to rush through the moment and get back to your table with your friends. So it's not one of those that we don't do stage very well. You know, we like people seeing the back of our heads and stuff. So I think it was just one of those of, oh God, I have to get up there and say something. And it's not the most fun moment.
Yeah.
I think actors do that very well.
Yeah. Do you remember when you got back to the table?
Nope. Nope.
I was always curious about that.
I think the most fun getting back to the table, and I'll just jump forward a little bit, was another editor that I worked with when we did the pilot for Frasier, Ron Volk, who's a phenomenal editor. We did that pilot, and that was a whole lot of fun. We always knew that Ron would do Frasier, and I would stay with Seinfeld. And for the longest time, we would, you know, one would win, one would lose, and all of that. And finally, one year, we're both sitting at the table, because this is when they did it in Pasadena in the auditorium, and the creative arts was always downstairs, and you'd be having dinner while they were presenting awards. So we're sitting at the table, and I looked at Ron and I said, well, if I have to lose, I hope I lose to you. And he said the same. And we're both thinking, yeah, I don't want to lose. And they opened the envelope, and they said, it's a tie. Now, for 1 millisecond, did either of us think it was somebody else? We just looked at each other like, we won! And we did, thank God. And getting up on the stage that time with somebody that you really, truly admired and respected and knew that you were just sharing that moment was, I think, one of the most fun moments. And then coming back to the table, I remember that was just like, that was really cool. So I don't know how often there are ties, but, you know, it's a great moment.
That's wonderful. How about the Bubble Boy?
The Bubble Boy was, I have no idea how Larry got the idea for that show, but it was one of those that you realized if you worked on the show long enough, he was going to probably annoy you at some point. Now, it's like I remember coming in saying, well, great, we annoyed all the Bubble people and we lost that audience. But you just knew that there was no place that Larry David wasn't willing to go. And I think that was one episode that was just hysterically funny, and I think in lesser hands wouldn't have been.
Yeah. Do you remember any specific reactions to it? Either in before it aired or when it aired?
No, I think that it was a big success,
Okay. The contest.
Well, the contest, I think one of the most amazing parts of it, if you really think about it, was the magazine that George was reading, Glamour. I think that was just like from the get-go, that episode was just truly great. And I think one of the really funny aside stories, because we talked about the fact that, Rick had told Warren Littlefield it was not going to be a problem. I think also when the network sponsors heard what the content was going to be, a lot of them pulled out. And then when they saw the episode and realized the reaction to it, a lot of them wanted to be part of it when it re-aired. And one of the things that was the most funny aspects of it was my husband's family is all of Japanese descent, and I was over at Thanksgiving dinner at one point after the show had aired, and a whole bunch of relatives are there, and this is one gentleman who teaches grammar school, and he said, well, he wanted to use the contest for their sex education classes in grammar school. And I thought, really? And he said, yeah, because you could really show it to a class and open them up to humor, which will then allow them to just sit and discuss something on a more real level. And I came back to work the next day. I said, Larry, you're not going to believe this. We're now an educational show. And he was just shocked. But you could really see that. It was a great idea.
Yeah. Now, that makes me think, in terms of the scripts, when did you, for instance, know that they were going to do the contest in the scheme of things?
Oh, well, Larry mentioned it to me one day. He was in the editing room, and it was just casual conversation, and he said, oh, I'm going to do a show about masturbation. I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, well, that should be fun. And, he was just very casual about it. But the thing that was fun about Larry was he had his office, and he would write out loud, where he would have a legal pad, and he'd just be writing everything in longhand, but he would say everybody's part. And that's also where the music comes from, where if he said it aloud, you just know, does it work or doesn't it?
That's great. And did he ever mention that you remember about what the origin of thinking of doing that episode came from?
No.
Okay.
No, I should have asked, but never did.
Yeah. Okay. Do you remember any stuff coming from Standards and Practices about it before it went to air?
Never. Nothing. That's the shocking thing. It's not one note, nothing. I don't remember ever getting a note from Standards and Practices during all the time that Seinfeld aired. I don't even remember getting notes, to tell you the truth. Yeah.
The pic, the one with Elaine's Christmas card.
Oh, yeah. That was one where Kramer does the photos of Elaine, and her nipple is actually showing in one of them. Supposedly, that came from a story that Larry had some really good friends, and they had had a little baby, and the husband and wife got up one morning, and we'll just say, for example, that the husband's name is Jeffrey. And Jeffrey was sitting with his robe on and had his son up on his knee, and his wife thought, oh, that's such a great, picture of the two of you. And she took a photo and made it their Christmas card and sent it out to everybody, only to get a phone call back from her mother-in-law saying, did you know you could see Jeffrey's penis in that picture? So yeah, Larry was always thinking of ideas for future scripts.
That's great. The Junior Mint.
The Junior Mint was, and I guess it's rare to have this happen, but this was actually a submission from another writer. And it was such a brilliant episode, and that Larry just picked it up and hired the writer, and it was just a huge success and hysterically funny.
Now, do you know if that writer, did he continue with the series after that, or was it
And
just
do you remember who the writer was on that?
I can't remember.
I can't remember
offhand.
either, but I know he came back the next year and was very intimidated by Larry, wound up getting a writing partner, and then came back and wrote again. So, Andy, yes, yeah, yeah,
Okay, well, that's interesting.
yeah.
The pilot,
The pilot.
the pilot within a.
Oh, okay. I think that probably that was something that Larry just really felt in his mind he needed to do. And I think what it gave us was a really good example of doing the reel about all the shows that we had done up until that point. It was really kind of fun to use that as the through line to all the other shows in the past. But I wanted to go back to Andy for 1 minute, because I
Okay.
remember when he did the Junior Mint and then he came in and actually had to work with Larry. Larry was just such a huge presence that I remember him saying that it was really difficult for him to actually pitch an idea to Larry, and that he ultimately went out and got a writing partner, and that made it a whole lot easier. But it's ironic when you're with Larry all the time and you're thinking Larry is just, and then you suddenly realize, no, Larry is like bigger than life. Larry is just like this huge presence. And I guess I was really fortunate to meet him at that time before the show was the mega hit, to really just sort of move up and feel comfortable. But you could really think back and say, oh yeah, it probably was very intimidating to pitch an idea to a genius.
That's great. And also, you received an Emmy nomination for the pilot.
Right.
Do you remember anything specific about it that made it stand out?
I think a lot of it was just thematically. It was just something that was unique and a little bit different. I think probably, though, the subway was just one of my absolute favorites.
Okay. The Cheever letters, where Jerry had inappropriate pillow talk about panties with Elaine's assistant. Anything specific you remember about that one?
Gee, I think that one's probably one that at the very end of that show, there was a laugh that the audience gave that I remember standing next to Larry, and he was shocked. He just suddenly realized the audience was so totally with us that laugh actually distorted on the track. And I think we had to use a different laugh, but it was one of those, it was just, nobody expected it. And it was just one of those great moments of Larry thinking, wow, they really love this.
That's great. The Lip Reader with Marley Manlin. Remember that one?
Nothing specific comes to mind about it.
Okay.
Sorry.
You were nominated for an Eddie
Yeah,
for that one.
yeah.
How about The Opposite?
The Opposite was great, because that was one that, true to form, it came in something like, I think it was 15 minutes over, and really working with Larry to figure out what to keep and what to lose, and realizing that was, I think on a writing level, was just a brilliant episode. And that was just, for me, just a no-brainer on submitting that one.
Do you remember you were talking about having, that's quite a lot of footage to get rid of. Was that something that would take a series of days, or was it because of the schedule you had to resolve immediately? I mean, was that he would say, let me come back and...
I think that, initially there were times when Larry would say, oh, I wish we had done this, or I wish we had done that. And I said, Larry, there's always time to do it. And I remember this one day me saying that to him, and later on he would come back and say, well, I think we did take the right amount of time or whatever, but you knew that it was something that really hit him, that that what made it on the air was something that he was in total control to be able to change or manipulate. And that I think he over time realized how vitally important it was to be in that room. And I think he had a good time in the editing room too. So I think it was one of those that, yeah, I think that he realized just how influential he was and how important it was to be there.
Do you ever remember any instances where he saw an edited show and realized there was something that could be improved and actually got some more footage or another scene or something?
No,
Okay.
no. I think, though, that one of the things that made me realize how very different Jerry was from Larry as far as humor. We were doing an episode, The Hamptons, and this was one where Jerry usually, as I said, came in later in the process. And this was one time when he came in a little bit earlier and just watched the show. And there was a lot of exposition at the head of the show, and Jerry wanted to lose a lot of it and get to the funny faster. And Larry just said, well, no, our audience knows us, and they know that whatever we're doing, they're going to get to funny soon enough. Don't worry about it. And they got into a big, little discussion about all of this. And then I realized it was at that moment in watching them go through all of this that I realized that my sense of humor was Larry's. And I think that was really just what planted the seed of just when Larry was going to leave, I was going to leave. And that staying with it through Jerry was just not going to be something that was just going to be as challenging.
Okay. Now, we had talked about the big salad.
Right.
And the origin of that.
Right.
And what was it like making the transition? This was at the point where the Tom Sharonis
Right.
Left,
Right.
and Andy Ackerman came in.
It was very, very comfortable. And I think that cast-wise and everybody that had to work with Andy just absolutely loved having him there. So I don't think there was any kind of a problem, and Andy was just a delight.
Do you remember why Tom left?
That's for other people to talk about.
Okay. How about the race?
That was the one with the Superman at the end of it. That was one that really reinforced the whole notion of music and editing and trying to figure out what music to use at the very end of it. I thought, wow, Superman would be really fun, but I always had this attitude, never use a piece of music unless you know it can be cleared. And so everybody said, oh, it's not going to be a problem, go ahead. And I laid it in and thought, wow, this works perfectly. And everybody thought it was really funny, it would be really great. And I think it wasn't until 2 days before the show aired that they actually got the okay to use it. And it was one of those that, and I'm sure everybody knows that as soon as you lock on to a piece of music, if you try to change it, that's just a nightmare because nothing will ever be as good. And trying to go and trying to find something else, it was a nightmare. And then finally they got to use it, so.
Well, that's great. Do you remember anything about how that episode came about?
Not particularly, no. I don't know the backgrounds for a lot of them.
Okay. How about Soup Nazi?
The Soup Nazi is based on a real guy back in New York. And my husband and I just found a guy that we referred to as the tempura Nazi, who's down in the South Bay. And really, you literally are convinced that if you ask for the wrong thing, that he won't serve you. I mean, he really has the same demeanor as the Soup Nazi. But apparently the Soup Nazi is a real guy, and I don't know him, but...
Yeah. Do you remember any specific, when you were editing that, knowing that it was going to, did you have any idea that it would become such a famous episode and people would be quoting that?
Oh, yeah. There was just a quality to it that you just had to know it was just going to be a major success.
Yeah. And that's interesting, too. Did you, when you had edited an episode that hadn't aired yet, but you knew was going to be, like, did you when you were like in the grocery store or whatever, and people were talking to you about the shows,
Oh, well,
did
they
you
wouldn't
ever?
talk to me because they didn't know what I did.
Well, I mean, people that didn't know what you did.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, did you ever say to people, "Oh, this one's coming up, you won't believe," kind of
No,
thing?
because people knew to watch, so I think it was one of those that you didn't have to remind anybody. It's kind of like you don't need to remind people to watch Mad Men.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Okay. The secret code, where Kramer rides the fire truck.
That was one where that was intercutting was what I did on that, and that was asking the writers, do you mind if I try something different? And then doing the intercutting on the fire truck was one that we did there, and it was one where I think the writers appreciated the fact of what you could do editorially, because it was never written that way.
Mm-hmm. And also wanted to ask you, in terms of like the green screen and the matte shots that you used,
Yeah.
were you making the decisions about how those were to be used with the characters?
Well, at that time, green screen wasn't what it is today, where you could literally put in the shots very easily in editing. You couldn't then. You literally had to get the cut scene, and then they would find the shots to put in the green screen. So it was Tim Kaiser who was in charge of post, who was in charge of doing that. And a lot of times we would just discuss what it needed and the speeds that stuff needed to be at, and they would go out and shoot things. And that was also the people back in New York would get that footage shot for us, but we would just pretty much lay out what kind of things we needed.
Okay. We're going to stop to change tape for a break.
No,
Okay.
well, we can keep going.
Okay. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the ensemble,
Okay,
the characters, the cast.
okay,
Julia Louis-Dreyfus.
right?
Did you work with her or have much of a relationship with her outside of the editing?
No, I think probably the one person that I did get to know a little bit more was probably Jason Alexander. And in later years, I did wind up doing his show, Bob Patterson. So, but I think just in watching everybody on that show, I think one of the things that truly became apparent was the true genius on the show was Larry, and that I have to say I was truly delighted that Curb became such a huge success. But as far as the individual actors, I didn't really get to know them all that well, to tell you the truth.
Did you watch them much when you would go down in terms of how they moved or whatever, in terms of, did that help you, just watching them from a distance and knowing how to cut them?
Well, I think the person who was the most studied in what he did was probably Michael, because there were so many pratfalls that he had to do, or the one where he's using the wheelchair in the store. He rehearsed that a tremendous number of times because there were just certain things that he wanted to do. So he was a very methodical actor, and I think each of them had their own little nuances, but they were also all very, very quick. I remember there was one scene where Jason had a scene in Monk's coffee shop where they literally wrote a whole page of dialogue that was extra, and he had to rehearse it and memorize it within about like a half hour or something, and he did it. And I thought, geez, you guys are amazing. So yeah, and I think a lot of it was because a really great writer knows how to write to those characters and knows the words that they would actually honestly say. So I think a lot of times it's easier for the actor in that character to memorize something because it's truly what they would say. And I remember Jason saying to me one time when we were taking out some dialogue from a scene, he was so absolutely right. He said, technically it sounds like you can take this piece out, but if you really listen to where I'm trying to go in that piece of dialogue, there's an arc to it, and you lost part of that arc. And I remember thinking, you're absolutely right, and that was just a great lesson to learn about what to keep and what to lose. Is sometimes you have to listen to that rhythm of what the actor's trying to do too, not just what, the writer might be trying to go for.
That's interesting. So, other than the ones we've talked about, are there any other episodes that stand out specifically that you remember?
Well, one I'd love to share a little story with is the Marbled Rye. And that was one where you really got to see that Larry really respected everybody's opinion and really didn't want to go for the cheap laugh. And it was one where Kramer fed navy beans to a horse, and there was going to be a horse and carriage ride later on, and obviously the horse is passing gas. And there was a shot that I used of the horse's butt, which was a POV of the two people in carriage. And Larry saw the cut and he said, "Oh, I don't know, that seems kind of cheap and stuff." I said, "No, it's not. It's just very funny." So he had me cut it another way without using the horse's butt. And then he had a whole bunch of people. He had me go around the building and find a bunch of people to come in and just, look at the two different versions. And then he actually really asked people a lot of questions about what did the butt, was it cheap or was it just truly funny? And once he felt really comfortable with everybody's reaction to it, he kept it in. But I thought that's truly an amazing guy, that he's willing to, seek other people's opinions and really respect them too. But that's what I mean about he wasn't going to use a joke or a cheap laugh, that it really had to be something honest and very earned.
Any others from a technical standpoint, or?
Nothing that's jumping out right this second.
Okay. Do you think Seinfeld had an impact on the way other comedies were edited?
I do. I really think that there was a snappiness to it and not waiting. I think that the thing that I liked about working on that was you don't need to get everything in that moment. Make people come back and watch it again and find something new and different in it. And I think that's what I liked about it a lot was, they'll catch the funny and they'll catch something actually new and different the next time that they see it. And I don't like laughter where you tell the joke, show the joke, and repeat the joke. It's like we live in a world where everything is just very, very quick, and I enjoy that.
That's great. Now, you left after season 7.
Right.
In 1996.
Right.
Can we talk a little bit about why was it specifically?
It was Larry. I just decided that, he's leaving. It's like, so can I. And I thought it would just be a great adventure. And I thought that if you stay, it's because it's easy. If you leave, it's because it's a challenge. And I think that one of the things that I learned early on in my career, not having gone to film school, was learn as much as you can from a lot of different situations. And so even early on, I would try to stay in a place maybe no more than a year. So you'd learn as much as you could and then leave and learn something new. And, it's like staying in one place. It's what have you really accomplished? Get out and try something different, especially when you're at a peak. And that's the best time to leave,
Do you remember getting any overtures when you?
Well, I started working with Diane English on Ink, and that was a whole lot of fun because she was a very different type of person to work with, and I so loved Murphy Brown that I thought that would be really great to work with her. And she's one of those people that she understands everybody's job. And so if you say it's going to take you an hour and a half to do something, she truly respects that it will, because she probably knows what it takes to do your job, or to do makeup, or to do whatever it might be, lighting. She knows she's asked those questions. So the other thing that was really great about working with her was she would truly give you her time. That if she said, "I'll be in at 11:30 and we'll work till 3, no other distractions, which is rare and unique. And so Diane was just a joy to work with. And it was there that I met Tommy Schlamme, who did the pilot for Sports Night. And that's how I sort of went into that little world.
Okay. Now, talking about ink,
Uh-huh.
what was the premise of that show?
It was taking place in a newsroom, and Ted Danson and Mary Steenburgen were the two people that worked there.
Okay. Um,
Didn't last too long.
yeah. What was the experience like for you, having come off Seinfeld being such a popular show, and going into a new show,
Right.
kind of starting again? Was there anything you remember?
Well, I think there's a level of reality hits you, that not everything is going to be a huge success and all of that. But that was kind of what I expected. I figured that you leave something like Seinfeld and it's going to take you a while to find something else that's as unique and special. And that's just part of the process. So it was disappointing because everybody that you work with you really like and you want it to be a big success. But by the same token, there's the reality check.
Now you talked a little bit about Diane English and working with her. Did she have any conversations with you about editorial in the beginning, in terms of what she was looking for in terms of a style?
No, but one of the things that I really liked about Diane, and it was radically different from Larry David, who wasn't afraid to do a show that was amazingly long. Diane really liked to have a show that was fairly close to time, as did the people that did Frasier. And just a completely different mindset on writing and the whole process. And what Diane would do is she would get a show timing, and if it looked like the show was running 4 minutes over, she would take a scene and literally rewrite a section of it so she could have the new section here and tag it on to the rest of what was going to be shot. So she could block out, like, okay, I lost a minute there. And she would literally give you alternates for different scenes so that it would be easy to get the show to time, which I thought that's genius.
Wow.
That's planning ahead.
Yeah.
But I think from working with Larry doing Seinfeld and doing things where, we would satellite something to Canada with 10 minutes to spare, when I looked at our shows like on Ink, and Diane would say, well, we don't have time to do that. And I would say, you have a week, and time to me was, there was just this huge luxury of, we're doing everything a week ahead of time, and that was just a great little bonus. So.
Right. And where was he done?
Over at CBS Radford.
It was also
Yeah,
Radford.
yeah.
Were you using the same setup editing-wise?
Were we on to something different? I want to say it was still Spectra System, but it may have changed by that point. We may have been on not Touch Vision. It would have been Lightworks possibly, or what was called HeavyWorks.
Okay.
So not exactly sure which little transition of editing we were in.
Right. Now you mentioned that was Ted Danson and Mary Steenburgen.
Right.
Now, did you work with them at all in the beginning? They were producing as well as starring.
Right. They were just a delight. I mean, just like down to earth, really just very gracious, kind people that, would have the cast and the crew over to their house. And Ted at that time had an electric car and would take people for a drive to show us how quiet his vehicle was and stuff, and say, yeah, if you get one, you could always plug it in at my house and stuff. And just absolutely wonderful people.
That's great. Anything else about that show and the way that it was done that you have specific memories of?
Nothing too specific, no.
Okay.
No.
But you did meet Tommy Schlamme.
Right.
And how did Sports Night come about?
Well, I think that Aaron Sorkin was interviewing different directors to do that show. And there were a number of people that came in thinking that this was going to be just your basic sitcom. And Aaron never saw it that way. And I think it was Tommy that realized this was something so unique and different that the two of them hit it off incredibly well. And I always say that I think Tommy visualizes Aaron's words, and it's just this perfect match of a writer and a director. And it's just one person gets the words and the other person gets the visuals, and it's a match made in heaven. And so that show was just meant to be for the two of them.
Yeah. And so what do you think about your editing made Tommy, was he the reason that you went to Sports Night specifically?
Yeah. I think probably it was just the energy and the snappiness of what I was trying to do on Seinfeld, because he really liked the very quick cuts and all of that. And I remember when we were even doing the show, we shot it in 16, and a lot of it was because you just didn't have the room. Well, you didn't have this technology, but you didn't have the room for bigger cameras or anything like that. And some of the operators would say, I can't imagine why we're shooting all of this. You're never going to use it. And I thought, yes, I will. And when they saw the show aired, they realized that every little piece was some part of the greater picture. And I think they all just started appreciating that all the work they were doing was really adding up to something really big.
Now, what was the premise of Sports Night, basically?
It was taking place in a sports studio, and I think it was just kind of a behind-the-scenes look at what that kind of world is really like. And from what I understand, Aaron spent a lot of time going to different sports shows and trying to get a sense of the rhythm of how they shoot them, how they use the different cameras and all of that, to give a sense of reality to the location.
Right. Now, where was it done? Remember?
We did that over at the Disney studio, and it was stage 6.
Okay.
And the magic of that was you'd get in every day, and we were all just stage 6. It's like hair, makeup, wardrobe, every department was in this one building, and you would never know from day to day where they'd be shooting, because they would use the hair and makeup room as an actual location, or they'd use the elevator on my floor or whatever, and it was always it was just really magical. It felt like, wow, we're all just going to work and making a TV show, and it was just really fun.
That's great. So who were the stars of Sports Night?
Well, there was Peter Krause and Josh Charles. They were the two anchors. And Felicity Huffman was the person who was the producer of the show. And Robert Guillaume just was the head of the whole studio. And Natalie, Sabrina Lloyd, and Josh Charles, and one more who played Jeremy, and Josh Molina. Quite a cast.
Yes.